Okay, I think we can start now. As everyone knows, my name is Lee Rothfarb, the program director for the Taubman Symposia. Good morning, Taubman community and other webinar guests, wherever you may be. And good evening to today's speaker, Rabbi Jeffrey Saks, who is visiting us via Zoom from Israel, 10 hours ahead of us in California. Welcome all to this session of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposia in Jewish Studies. As already announced by flyer, Rabbi Saks is going to speak on the writings of distinguished Israeli author Shmuel Yosef Agnon. First, though, some background on Rabbi Saks and his multifaceted career. He is a prominent modern Orthodox educator, writer, and editor who has published widely on Jewish thought, education, and literature. He earned his professional credentials at New York's Yeshiva University, a BA, an MA, and then rabbinic ordination. After moving to Israel in 1994, he was named director of Yeshivat HaMiftar in Efrat, where he now lives. Additionally, Rabbi Saks is the founding director of the Academy for Torah Initiatives and Directions in Jewish Education, ATID for short, and its online program, webyeshiva.org. Further, he edits the periodical Tradition, a journal of Orthodox Jewish thought, and teaches at Midreshet Amodim, where young people engage Jewish texts and ideas, the internet explains, with nuance, honesty, and depth, weaving together classical sources and modern questions. Finally, relevant for the subject of his talk today on Agnon, Rabbi Saks is the Director of Research for Jerusalem's Agnon House. That institution focuses on the writings of Agnon, who in 1966 received the Nobel Prize in Literature, the only writer in Hebrew to receive that high honor. Rabbi Saks's talk today traces how Agnon's remarkable acceptance speech for the prize vividly expresses the intertwining of personal destiny, Jewish history, and the art of storytelling. Before turning the program over to Rabbi Saks, I remind everyone to type questions into the webinar chat while the talk is underway. Don't wait till the end. As he's speaking, please feel free to type in your questions. So welcome again to Rabbi Saks. We're eager to hear your presentation that takes the title, Between Catastrophe and Creativity, Shmuel Yosef Agnon's Nobel Prize and the Jewish Response to Trauma.
Thank you so much, Lee. And thanks to all the organizers of the Taubman Symposia, to yourself and to Richard Hecht for your kind invitation to join you today. We were joking before when your invitation to speak in Santa Barbara arrived. It was a particularly cold, bitterly rainy day here in Israel, and I was so excited at the prospect of visiting Santa Barbara, but you had buried the lead. I had to scroll down to discover that it was an invitation on Zoom, but nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here with you and with all the many participants to talk about Shai Agnon, Hebrew literature's only Nobel laureate. When he won the prize in 1966, at the time, he was the only Israeli to win in any field. In intervening years, I think we've chalked up quite a few prizes here in the Jewish state, in the sciences, in economics, and even I think 3 prizes for peace, Nobel Peace Prizes, which is of course ironic, particularly these days, because we're painfully aware of how much that achievement still evades us. But Agnon's receipt of the Nobel Prize in 1966, just a half a year before the Six-Day War, was really a transitional moment in the country, the young country. The state was only 18 years old at the time, and it was really a recognition of the achievements, certainly first and foremost of this remarkable author, Hebrew literature itself, the Hebrew language, which had reawoken and had come back to life as a language of modern expression, and Agnon's very intricate and nuanced weaving between older layers of Hebrew and his intertextual matrix in which he was mining the entirety of the classical Jewish bookshelf from the Bible through the rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Agadah, medieval Hebrew writing, medieval Hebrew poetry, the writings of the certainly Hasidic tales, the writings of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and of course the Yiddish and Hebrew authors, modern Hebrew authors that had preceded him, to take the entirety of the Jewish bookshelf, Lidoroteha, throughout all of its many permutations and generations, and to distill it down and to pour it out into the mold of modern literature was indeed a great accomplishment, and a way that modern literature, modern Hebrew, modern Israeli literature, at least from Agnon's pen, was in dialogue with all of those earlier texts. We're not going to study today one of his stories, although I commend that to your attention. Many of us, of course, will read Agnon in translation, and one of the projects I was involved in the last number of years was I'm very proud of the Toby Press Agnon series, which is 15 volumes of Agnon's work in revised translation or new translation with commentary and annotations that help unpack some of his source work. And of course, those that are able to read Agnon in translation really should do so. Those of us that are really very much engaged in Jewish life and Jewish learning and Jewish literature will find him to be a very rewarding experience. And from the names I see on the screen, I know many of you have studied with us in the past at Agnon House or involved in other Agnon initiatives around the world, so you know what I'm talking about. But instead of studying one of his stories, which really we ought to do at some other time, and when you're next visiting Jerusalem, please come to us at the Agnon House and participate in some of our programs there. But we're going to be discussing Between Catastrophe and Creativity, Agnon and the Jewish response to trauma, particularly as it was embedded in the speech he delivered in December 1966 on Alfred Nobel's Yahrzeit, the day on which the Nobel Prize is awarded in Stockholm, and the speech that he delivered as the literature laureate, in which he made, at least in my reading, a very profound statement about the state of Jewish culture, the state of Jewish creativity, and the fluctuations of Jewish history. Remember, this was 1966. The ashes had barely settled over Europe. Auschwitz was not the distant memory that it is becoming. This Tuesday, of course, is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And part of the challenge of that is that really for most of us, it is memory. There are so few survivors left. And that's one of the great challenges of Jewish history. When Agnon received the prize in 66, recipients of the Nobel received the prize and a certain amount of cash, the gold medal and a certain amount of cash, and a diploma. You see Agnon's diploma here, and if you visit us in Agnon House, you can see the original. It's a customized work of art. It's very interesting. I read an interview a few years ago with the house artist, not the fellow who painted this work for Agnon, who's long since dead, but there's a house artist of the Nobel Committee, and every year he receives the list of the laureates at the same time that they're announced, that everybody else discovers, which is usually in October. And again, the prize is always given on December 10th, Nobel's Yahrzeit, and he has just a few weeks to prepare these works of art. Sometimes they're 15, 16, 17 recipients of the prize, because certainly in the sciences, chemistry and physics and medicine, the prizes are very often shared amongst 2 or 3 people, so you can have a good number of people, and the work of art has to somehow reflect the achievement of the recipient of the prize. And the current or the then artist who receives the commission to do this said in this interview that it's a terrible amount of pressure, because after all, he doesn't know anything about chemistry or physics or medicine. He's not so well read in world literature, and certainly what does he know about world peace? But every year they tell him that this this Japanese professor is winning the prize for his achievements in chemistry, and that Nigerian author might be getting the Nobel for her poetry, and he has to do a crash course on each of them so that he can artistically create something that represents that work. I've made it my business to look at some of these, and you on the website of the Nobel Prize, nobelprize.org, I think you can see some of these. I think in recent years, they've tended to be much more abstract, which I guess gives the artist a little wiggle room. But the artist, whose name was Brusewitz back then in the 60s, uh, uh, on the left here, you see there's a menorah, very typically a Jewish symbol. But the work of art at the center of the diploma, which you can see here, has some very interesting elements to it. At the top, you see Jerusalem, the old city behind the wall. Remember, this is December 66. It's a half a year before the Jewish people would return to the old city of Jerusalem, which for Agnon was such a powerful center of gravity. Agnon had come on Aliyah to the land of Israel from his native town of Buchach. Buchach is today in western Ukraine, but when he comes, it was the easternmost reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was part of the region called Galicia, and he comes on Aliyah in 1908. Between 1912 and 1924, he goes for what turns out to be a rather long detour in Germany, where he meets his wife, and he comes under the patronage of his publisher, Shlomo Zalman Shoken, who the Shoken Publishing House is still Agnon's publisher to this day. But in 1924, he returns to Jerusalem, where he lives throughout his entire life until his death in 1970. But of course, from 1948 until 1967, the old city of Jerusalem is on the other side of the border. So when the artist paints this, he's representing the old city of Jerusalem. You see there at the top the walls of the old city as this center of imaginative gravity in Agnon's writings. At the bottom of the painting, you see this river and the Black Bridge and the houses on either side, either bank of the river. This is Buchach. This is Agnon's hometown. The artist may have been somewhat influenced by images of, I don't know, Marc Chagall or something, but I've been to Buchach, and indeed there is a black bridge that crosses the river Stripa, a rather narrow little river. This is not the Mississippi of Mark Twain, but that's Buchach. That's the other imaginative center of gravity in Agnon's writings. And in fact, the majority of his stories in his 23 collected volumes, the majority of the stories take place in Eastern Europe, take place in Galicia, take place in the Altaheim, the old home, the hometown, which he leaves at the age of 20 and only really makes one return visit, or one and a half very brief return visits, but it never leaves him. You can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. He leaves at the age of 20, and he spends the next 6 decades trying to write his way back. And in this regard, the comparison to Mark Twain is fit. The comparison to so many other great authors for whom place is so central, but who are often writing about place and home and hometown from a great distance. When Mark Twain was writing Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, he was living in Manhattan and in Connecticut. When James Joyce is writing about Dublin, he's living on the continent. He hadn't been back to Ireland in many years, so on and so forth. In the center of the diploma is the shrine of the book, that white, strangely formed building, which houses at the Israel Museum, houses the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had just opened a few, earlier that year. This rather strange architectural feature of Jerusalem was then very much the icon of modern Jerusalem. Today, those of you that have been to Jerusalem know, today the icon of modern Jerusalem is the suspension bridge, the Gesher Meitarim, at the entrance to the city. Today, that's what they would have put on it. But the shrine of the book the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Museum, that was the symbol of modern Jerusalem in 1966. Superimposed over the whole thing is the three-leaf clover, symbolic of the medieval bunting map, that very, very old map of the world with the three continents, Europe and Asia and Africa, with Jerusalem at the center of the world. And to the left, in the margin, you see the smokestacks and the barbed wire, because there was a real recognition that this prize was going to a European born Hebrew writer living in Jerusalem, a living testimony to the resurrection of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, the Jewish language, and Jewish culture less than 20 years, a historical blink of the eye since the Shoah. And even though Agnon, of course, spent the years of World War II living in Jerusalem, and his own family, in fact, had either, his parents at that point had passed away, and his siblings had all left the old world to come either here to Israel or to the United States. And the Shoah, the Holocaust, does not play an oversized role, at least on the surface of his writings, but is there between the lines, at least certainly all that was written after the Shoah. Much of his great writing had been completed before the war, but it's there between the lines of everything. He's not a Holocaust author in the manner of Aaron Appelfeld or Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, you name it, but it's conscious. He's struggling with a consciousness of the fate of Europe, what had befallen European Jewry, and his role as an author in trying to document through literature, through fiction, document the world that was lost. So when he wins the prize in 66, and maybe some of you are old enough to remember that moment, it's really seen in this way as a prize for the man, but for this much bigger meaning. The great Hebrew poet Yehuda Amichai, who was living in New York at the time, writes a little essay, a little memoiristic essay, in which he recalls what it meant for him as an Israeli, as a Hebrew poet and a Hebrew author, that Agnon, the great Agnon, under whose shadow everyone in Amichai's generation, Amichai and Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yehoshua, all of them work and write in the shadow of Agnon. Amichai writes, the reaction to the news in Israel was typical of the country. At the present moment, I happen to be in New York, but somehow I picture the way Israelis celebrated the event as similar to the spontaneous rejoicing that broke out when the UN partition decision was announced in December 47. Such spontaneous outbursts are characteristic of many small nations and are the product of much genuine and intense human warmth, though they are apt to induce an ironic smile in the beholder. According to some Israelis, the true winner of the award was the Jewish people itself. And then he goes on to describe some other things. In any case, the rejoicing was like a Jewish wedding, with much feasting, noise, confusion, and tears of joy. As a crowning touch, a minor scandal was created when the religious parties violently attacked the government radio station for broadcasting an interview with Agnon, a religious author, on the Sabbath, a broadcast to which he himself had not objected. In short, the entire prize-giving resembled nothing so much as a good-natured satire on Israeli society, the like of which no one but Agnon himself could have written. Amid the commotion, the main point was all but forgotten, namely that a talented author was finally being honored by the world for his ability to portray the realities within him and around him in his books. In an interview, and there were many such interviews, of course, with Agnon at the time on the radio, in print. Agnon had a very, very healthy sense of himself. He had a very strong sense of his talents. And as a matter of fact, it had been almost 20 years in the making, the campaign to try to get him the Nobel. He was and also ran a number of times, having been nominated from the 1940s and on multiple times. But when he wins, he puts on kind of air of false modesty. They say, "What will you do now that you've won the prize?" It's like the commercials in America. What will you do now that you've won the Super Bowl? I'm going to Disney World. What are you going to do now that you've won the Nobel Prize? So he said, "What am I going to do now? I'm going to still eat my soup with only one spoon." And he says that the prize is the recognition of what the Hebrew language has done and will do. And he hopes that now that the whole wide world has recognized the Hebrew language and Hebrew literature, maybe even Israelis will start to think highly of it. The country was, of course, as Amichai described, was really turning itself upside down. Even before the prize, Agnon was the most famous man of letters in the country. He may have been the most famous Israeli, perhaps second only to David Ben Gurion. Teddy Kollek, the mythological mayor, long-term mayor of Jerusalem, commissions this Tfilat Haderech, this wayfarer's prayer, written by a ritual scribe, by a Sofer Stam on cloth, on vellum, like a Sefer Torah itself, for Agnon to take with him to recite airplane on his way to Stockholm to receive the prize. When Agnon receives the prize, he's already quite an old man. He's already nearing 80, which I know that there are some people that are already that age now. But remember, 50, nearly 60 years ago, this coming year, this December, it'll be 60 years since the prize. 60 years ago, 80 was a lot older than it is today. 80 today is the new 60. So he's nearing, he was much older than the average laureate. The average age for a Nobel laureate is somebody who still has another novel or two left to write in their career. And when you receive the Nobel, it's not for a particular work. It's a life achievement prize. It's for the entirety of your canon, but it's usually given to somebody who's still going to, be publishing quite a bit more. At this point, Agnon, he had really slowed down. He was at work on a number of major projects that he was struggling with that were only published posthumously. As a matter of fact, Agnon's daughter, Emunah Yaron, who I was fortunate to have a personal connection with, was his literary executor and published from the archives more books after Agnon died than he had published in his own lifetime. And he was, working on projects and he was writing, but his rate of publishing had slowed down in the later years. He's already an older man, a little round in the middle. He's wearing a tuxedo and a white tie with his big black yarmulke, the mark of the religious Jew that he was. He looks rather ridiculous. He looks rather something like a penguin. And there he is in Stockholm amid the crowned heads of Europe and the entire diplomatic corps, except, of course, for the Arab nations, which boycotted the awarding of a prize to an Israeli. The whole thing must have been terribly overwhelming. The prize was given on a Saturday. Sunset in December in Stockholm is quite early. So Shabbat ended early enough for him to get there by the skin of his teeth. But it happens that it wasn't just any Shabbat. It was the Shabbat of Hanukkah, 1966. So as Shabbat goes out, he has to say Havdalah. He has to light a Hanukkah candle. He has to shave. He has to take a shave because, after all, he's going off to greet the king of Sweden, and a person doesn't go to greet a king with 5 o'clock shadow after having not shaven since Friday. And they clear the streets. He had a police escort. This was, of course, all arranged through the Israeli embassy. He had a police escort to shuttle him to get there at the very, very, very last second. And he apparently, by all accounts, enjoyed, stringing everybody along through all this dramatic performance of his ritual commitments on Motzei, Shabbat, Chanukah, in order to get still to the prize, to the ceremony in time. Here he is with the king of Sweden. King of Sweden was a tall, skinny man, and Agnon was a little short, round in the middle fellow. Freud, in his book on humor, Freud observes that there's something inherently comic about the juxtaposition of tall and skinny and short and round. Think of the great comedic pairings: uh, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Jerry Seinfeld and George Costanza, Mutt and Jeff, you name it. Right? There's something funny about this juxtaposition. The king was very tall. Agnon was a little short. It's not so obvious in this thing because the king's bending over. The king apparently was also a little hard of hearing, so he has to cup his ear to hear what Agnon is telling him. And when Agnon receives the prize, there's a ceremony. You can, on the Nobel Prize site, you can watch clips of these old newsreels of the whole thing. They call his name. He goes up. He gets the diploma and the prize. I don't know if the check comes later or they hand it to him in an envelope. I'm not sure of that. And then you go around and you stand there and you shake hands with you come down and you shake hands with the king. You probably meant to just say a word or two of hello and greeting and thank you, something like that. But like at the Academy Awards, if you go on too long, they start playing the trumpets to move you off the stage. There's a video of this. You can't hear what they're saying, and at a certain point, you hear the trumpets bam, ba-da-dum, bam, bam, to kind of move them along. They must be speaking in German. Aside, of course, from Hebrew and Yiddish, German was the only language that Agnon had any facility with. He could not speak English. He certainly could not speak Swedish. And they're talking. Agnon, there's Agnon. He's got his big black yarmulke on, and he's kind of shuckling back and forth in a rather rabbinic or Talmudic fashion. And there's the king cupping his ear, leaning over, and he's probably imagining, what is this rabbi yammering on about? We don't know what they're saying. Here is Nellie Saks, no relation to me. She spelled her name differently. In 1966, the Nobel Prize in Literature was shared. As I mentioned, this happens all the time in the sciences. And you can understand that in science, people both work together, but people also work in competition. And sometimes it's that kinat sofrim tarbei chokhmah, says the Mishnah in Avot, that the kind of competition increases wisdom and increases learning and study because people are working in competition. And one laboratory is going to advance based upon the developments in another, and vice versa. In literature, it's quite unusual. It's not the first time it happened, but it's quite rare that the literature prize is shared. Nellie Saks was a German-born poetess, a German Jewish poetess. She wrote poetry in German. After the war, she was living in Stockholm, which may be how the judges had greater familiarity with her. One of the problems of poetry is the challenge of translation. Translation is a challenge for all literatures. Agnon, who wrote in prose, of course, presents his own set of challenges in translation. But poetry, of course, as I hope you understand, poses particular troubles. I've never been able to really get a good solid handle on Nellie Saks's poetry, although it is available in translation. And she was a German Jewish poetess who was writing poetry about the Holocaust after the war in German. There is no doubt that the decision to give the prize to the two of them on the same year, a German Jewish poetess writing about the Shoah and an Israeli Hebrew author living in Jerusalem, documenting, partially in his writing, documenting the world that was lost. There can be no doubt that this was a deliberate choice. As a matter of fact, we know now the proceedings of the Nobel Committee, of course, are secret, but the archives are opened up 50 years after the awarding of the prize. So a little less than a decade ago, we were privy to some of the deliberations that the committees had. A joint prize for Saks and Agnon had already been discussed, and they were, as it were, runners up the year before in 1965. And then ultimately receive it in 1966. Agnon wasn't thrilled, despite the tenderness of this particular picture. Agnon wasn't thrilled with sharing the prize, particularly with somebody, frankly, he had never heard of before the announcement. When the prize is awarded, the head of the committee that presents the prize says, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, Nellie Saks, this year's literary prize goes to you both with equal honor for literary production, which records Israel's vicissitudes, Israel here meaning the Jewish people's vicissitudes in our time, and passes on its message to the peoples of the world. And then he says, Mr. Agnon, in your writing we meet once again the ancient unity between literature and science. Science has antiquity to it, meaning something having to do with a philosophical understanding. In one of your stories, you say that some will no doubt read it as they read fairy tales. Others will read it for edification. Your great chronicle of the Jewish people's spirit and life has therefore a manifold message. For the historian, it is a precious source. For the philosopher, an inspiration. For those who cannot live without literature, it is a mine of never-failing riches. We honor in you a combination of tradition and prophecy, of saga and wisdom. And then he goes on to say that we honor you both, you two Jewish authors, this evening, as the laurel-crowned heroes of intellectual creation, and express our conviction that, in the words of Alfred Nobel, you have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind, and that you have given it clear-sightedness, wisdom, uplift, and beauty. A famous speech at a Nobel banquet, that of William Faulkner, held in this same hall 16 years ago, contained an idea which he developed with great intensity. It is suitable as a concluding quotation which points to the future. I do not believe in the end of man. Now, Faulkner could be added to the list of those authors I mentioned before. Faulkner creates this fictionalized Yoknepahala County in Mississippi, which is his own hometown. It's his own Buchach. It's his own Hannibal on the banks of the Mississippi. Faulkner had received the prize in 1949, but only accepted it, or only was able to, when you receive a prize, you have to actually go to Stockholm. And today, it's much easier. Everybody shows up on the same day. They fly in. Back then, it was a little harder. So it happened on different occasions that people would show up at a later date and receive their prize and give their speech then. So Faulkner did this in 1950. 1950, 16 years earlier, really is just a very, very short time after the war. And he says, our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. He's talking about Hiroshima. He's talking about Nagasaki. He's talking about the Holocaust. He's talking about the horrors and terrors and traumas that have been visited upon humanity in the last half decade. This is what he's saying in 1950. They're no longer problems of the spirit. There's only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today, young authors, have forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. This is like in the shadow of Hiroshima. We've forgotten what it means to live. Because we've forgotten what it means to live, we've forgotten what it means to produce art and to produce literature. And what is that? The problems of the human heart in conflict with itself. Well, when Mr. Anderson points to this speech by Faulkner to say that's what Agnon is about, he really did understand something about Agnon, or at least whoever it was that wrote the speech understood something about Agnon. That the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, that's what makes good writing, because that is the theme of Agnon's storytelling. The transitions that the Jewish people had undergone in the movement from tradition to modernity, from the old world to the new, from Europe to the land, the return to the land of Israel, from Yiddish to reawoken Hebrew, and always the transition from a world in which faith is a given and absorbed with mother's milk to a world of doubt, a world of faith that has to be earned in a different way or not earned, right? Where it can no longer be taken for granted. That is the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's what Faulkner says. Until such a person relearns these things, he will write as though he stood among and watched the end of man. I, says Faulkner, I decline to accept the end of man. And that too could have been said about Agnon or said by Agnon. But when it comes time for Agnon to deliver his Nobel Prize speech, he did something very curious. Well, first of all, there was a big question. How was Agnon going to deliver this speech in Stockholm? This is before the days of simultaneous translation. Agnon really could have only spoken, as I said, in Hebrew, Yiddish, or German. If he spoke in Hebrew, nobody was going to understand him. Yiddish, even less. And it was unimaginable that he would stand in the heart of Europe just 18, 19 years after the Shoah and speak in German as the laureate of Hebrew literature. So he composes his speech in Hebrew. He reads the opening section in Hebrew, and there's a recording of that available on the Nobel Prize website. And then the entire speech is read on his behalf in English. And you can read the entire thing again on the Nobel Prize site. But the speech that he delivers is really extraordinarily curious. He feels, first of all, he gets up there, he makes a blessing, B'Shemu Malchut, upon seeing a king. The Talmud does dictate that there is a blessing to be recited when you see a king of flesh and blood, and he recites the blessing upon seeing the king of Sweden. And then he says, the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kaf Gimel Amud Aleph, 23a, says that in Jerusalem, the men of discrimination, Nikiyei Hadat Shebirushalayim, men of distinction, men of discrimination, did not sit down to dine in company unless they knew who their companions were to be. So I will now tell you who I am, whom you have agreed to have at your table. The Talmud says that it's a mark of refinement not to sit down and dine in public. Let's say you're traveling and you have to stop at the wayside inn, at the pub, and you sit down at the public table. You never know who you're going to be dining with. It could be people of ill repute or unrefined manners. And since maybe that might rub off on you, a person of distinction doesn't dine with strangers unless he knows something about their character. So, Your Royal Majesty, King Gustav of Sweden, since I know you're careful about this Gemara and Sanhedrin, I know that you can't sit down to dine with me unless I tell you something about myself. This is the most curious kind of Talmudic finger wagging. By way of introducing who he is, by saying his biography, he frames it in this way. But then his biography is completely imagined. What he actually tells the people is incredible, but is quite profound, because it says something. If you read agnonically between the lines, it says something about what he thought he was doing in his writing. What he says after introducing the Talmudic requirement for him to introduce himself is a statement that was so famous that for many years, for many decades, when Agnon's picture was on the 50 shekel note here in Israel, only very recently did they redesign the money and they cycled out all of the former people whose faces were on the bills with new people. Now, actually, it's quite nice. Now it's all modern Hebrew poets that are on the money. At the time, Agnon was the only man of letters to be so honored. The rest were all politicians. But what he says by way of introducing himself was so famous that it appeared on the 50 shekel bill next to his face in this micrography. And it's every Israeli that had 50 shekels in his pocket for all those years was carrying around Agnon's Nobel Prize speech. I'm going to play you a clip of it in Hebrew just so you can hear the music of it.
מתוך קטסטרופה היסטורית שהחליף טיטוס מלך רומי את ירושלים וגלה ישראל מארצו, נולדתי אני באחת מערי הגולה, אבל בכל עת תמיד דומה הייתי עליי כמי שנולד בירושלים.
First of all, you hear his thick Galician accent. He sounds like you're Zayde or somebody's Zayde. If you're at all, as I am, as all immigrants are self-conscious about your own Hebrew accent, you can take a little comfort that here's the master of the Hebrew language, and he sounds like he just walked out of Poland. But what he says is fascinating. He says, "You want to know who I am? As a result of the historic catastrophe in which Titus of Rome destroyed Jerusalem and Israel was exiled from its land, I was born in one of the cities of the exile. But always I regarded myself as one who was born in Jerusalem. In a dream, in a vision of the night, I saw myself standing with my brother Levites in the holy temple, singing with them the songs of David Melech Israel, melodies such as no ear has heard since the day our city was destroyed and its people went into exile." He says, who am I? I'm Tisha B'Av. I'm the year 70. When was I born? Well, in fact, Agnon was actually born on August 8th, 1887. He always claimed to have been born on August 8th, 1888, the numerically lyrical 8888. It was part of the midrashicizing of his biography. Everything about him was mythologized. His birth date, his name, of course, was not Agnon. Agnon was a pen name that he adopts upon arrival at the age of 20 in the land of Israel. His birth name was Shmuel Yosef Chachkis. He claimed to have been born on August 8th, 88, on Tisha B'Av, the day that marks the calamitous destruction of both Jerusalem temples. In fact, August 8th did not fall out on Tisha B'Av, neither in 1888 nor in 1887, the year he was actually born. It was around then. He rounded it off about 10 days. But Tisha B'Av, of course, is such a symbolically pregnant date in the Jewish calendar. It's both the date of destruction and calamity and catastrophe and diaspora and exile and galut and dispersion, but it also has embedded within it the seeds of redemption. The Talmud says that the Messiah himself is born on Tisha B'Av, meaning the potential for redemption comes hand in hand at the moment of catastrophe. Now, Agnon was not making a messianic claim by saying that he himself was born on Tisha B'Av because he was Levite. He was a descendant of the tribe of Levi, of which he was very proud. And of course, according to our tradition, the Messiah can only come from the tribe of Judah, a descendant of King David. He says, "I'm a Levi. I'm a Levi. I'm a Levite." And it's like bizarre, like he said. And like, if tomorrow morning, Your Royal Highness, if tomorrow morning you want to make a minyan and you need somebody to call up for the second aliyah, I'm your man. They probably had no idea what he's talking about. So he says, I'm a Levite. And what was the job of the Leviim in the holy temple? The job of the Leviim was to sing the psalms, to sing the songs, the sweet songs of David, king of Israel. I was born in the exile. I was born in Buchach. Why was I born in Buchach? Because the Romans came and carted off my cradle to the exile. That's the way Elie Wiesel kind of retold Agnon's point here. But if history had not taken a detour in the year 70, I today would be living in Jerusalem. I would have been born in Jerusalem. And as a Levite, I would be singing the songs, the greatest poetry ever composed in the Hebrew language. I suspect that the angels in charge of the shrine of music, fearful lest I sing in wakefulness what I had sung in dream, made me forget by day what I had sung at night. For if my brethren, the sons of my people, were to hear, they would be unable to bear their grief over the happiness they had lost. To console me for preventing me from singing with my mouth, they enable me to compose songs in writing. Now remember, in Hebrew, shirah, poetry, songs, and prose have a much greater overlap than we think of it in English. In English, we think there's poetry and there's prose, and they're two different genres. In Hebrew, there's a much greater overlap. After all, the Torah itself, principally a work of prose, but the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, refers to itself as shirah, as poetry, because there's something poetic about it, even when it's not writing. So what is Agnon saying? He's saying that his work as a modern Hebrew author is a substitute for a form no less than divine service in the Holy Temple, where he would have been engaged in the poetic and musical act. And in order to compensate him, he's allowed to compose in prose what was formerly sung in praise. It's a very radical historical as well as theological statement if we're reading it correctly. And then he told his audience that I was 5 years old when I wrote my first song. Indeed, when Agnon was young, he did start writing poetry, first in Yiddish, then in Hebrew. At a certain point, he commits himself only to being a Hebrew author, which was, of course, a very curious choice in the first decade of the 20th century, because at that time there were a couple thousand readers of modern Hebrew literature, and there were a couple of million readers of Yiddish. But the commitment to being a Hebrew author was so strong that he leaves Yiddish behind, and indeed he leaves poetry behind, recognizing where his talents lie. I was 5 years old when I wrote my first song. It was out of longing for my father that I wrote it. It happened that my father, of blessed memory, went away on business. I was overcome with longing for him, and I made a song. Agnon had a very, very happy and very stable family life. He actually grew up in some comfort. This is not the kind of image of poverty, of Eastern European suffering that was so common to so many other authors, experiences that those authors mined in their writings. He had a very close relationship with his father. His father was his principal teacher. His father was a rabbi, a very learned man, but he made his living in the fur and leather trade, and he would have to travel to the regional fairs and trading and whatnot on business. And when father would go away, the little boy is longing for him. He's overcome with longing for him, and he made a song. Elsewhere, in a speech that Agnon gave in 1959 on receiving an honorary doctorate at Bar-Ilan University, he had touched on these themes at that occasion, 7, 8 years earlier, themes that he revisits in Stockholm in 66. And in this text, which is unfortunately not translated, it's a speech that he gave on that occasion, he tells this story. He says that, and I'll just give a loose translation of the Hebrew text you see on the screen. He says, my father went off to one of these for business. Mirov ga'aguim al Abba, out of profound longing for my father. And one need not be a scholar of Midrash or a PhD in literary criticism to understand the multivalences of the symbols here. Distance from father in heaven. Mirov ga'aguim al Abba, out of abundant longing for my father, I was in a fog the whole day. One day, the end of the day, I came home from cheder, from the traditional schoolhouse. Gavru alai ga'aguai. My longing for father had overcome me. I put my head on the wall and began to cry. Nitakra anacha milibi v'karati. a sigh, a wailing, a geschrei, a gewalt goes up from my heart, and I call out, Eifo ata Abba Abba. And as the words are coming out of my mouth, another stitch, another rhyme joins the first. Ahafti otcho ahava rabba. Eifo ato Abba Abba, ahafti otcho ahava rabba. A rhyme might be something like, Father, Father, where can you be found? And I who love you with a love so profound. First of all, it's whether it's historical or not is irrelevant. It's the story he chooses to tell himself of the initiation of the young boy into the literary art. The first time he crafts a rhyme, it spills out of his mouth almost with the description of prophecy, which comes onto the biblical prophet from some unknown source from above. He's crying, the way little kids cry and they can hardly get the words out. And the words that come out, a 5-6-year-old boy, earlier he said he was 5, here he says he was 6 or 7, doesn't matter. The words that come out are in Hebrew. A Yiddish-speaking boy in Buchach suddenly is like crying out spontaneously in Lashon HaKodesh, the holy sacred tongue. And he's comforted. I was astounded by this little rhyme that came out. Now, this little rhyme, this little ditty is not something you get the Nobel Prize for, but it's his first literary creation, meaning it's the first time where he's able to express something deep and profound in words that he composes. In this case, this particular case, a rhyme. He discovers the secret of Jewish creativity. That the most authentic response to pain, to anguish, to longing, to suffering is creativity. That's the Jewish response to trauma. Of course, Jewish trauma, it hasn't gone away, but it's been around for a long time. He spoke of Tisha B'Av and he spoke of the Psalms. And we're reminded of Tehillim Perek Kuf Lamed Zayin, chapter 137 of the Psalms. Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Et Sion. It's a song that's sung by those that were carried off from Jerusalem to Babylonia. The Levites, those that used to sing the songs of David in the Holy Temple, just as Agnon imagined that he should have been singing the songs of David in the temple. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Sion. And they take their musical instruments, their lyres, and they hang them up on the trees, meaning they hang them out to dry, because what do we need these musical instruments that we used to play in the Holy Temple to sing the holy songs in front of God? Here al admat nechar. But the tormentors, for their own amusement, say to the Jews, Shiru lanu mishir Tzion, sing us one of those old songs of Zion. It's like the imagery of African slavery in the American South, where the taskmasters had this kind of bizarre idea that if the field hands would just keep singing, they'll forget how miserable they are, and they'll forget that they want to rise up and kill us. And that gives rise to the whole genre of American music, of much of American music, and the spirituals, and go down Moses way down to Egypt land, right? Swing low, sweet chariot. Decamp town races sing that song, doo-dah, doo-dah, right? The idea that the tormenting that the overlords, that the taskmasters, the tormentors, places. They're so cynical, right? The Babylonians tell these Jews, why don't you sing us those songs you used to sing in that old holy temple? How could we sing the songs of the holy temple here on foreign soil, here by the waters of Babylon? But then when they do sing, what comes out? What's the new song, the Shir Chadash, that they sing al admat nechar? It's the song of the Jew in exile. Agnon had said, I was born in one of the cities of the diaspora, but I always imagined myself as if I were born in Jerusalem. And here they are, having been born in Jerusalem, taken off to Babylonia and told to sing. What do they sing? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour, Agnon is saying between the lines of what he's doing. He goes to Stockholm in 1966. He receives a prize for his own phenomenal achievements, and they were phenomenal. He receives a prize for the Jewish people. He receives a prize for the state of Israel. He receives a prize for the Hebrew literature and language, which has been reawoken. But he's also saying something about the condition of what had happened in Europe within the living memory of every single person that was in that auditorium. You're giving me a prize? You're giving a prize to this author from the land of Israel? You're giving a prize to this Hebrew author? Let me explain to you what you're actually awarding me for. Because you are awarding me for my work as a creative literary artist. And a creative Jewish artist is always, to be a Jewish artist, you have to be engaged with Jewish memory, because Jewish creativity is a response to the Jewish suffering. It's the way that we overcome. It's not true that it's our sense of humor that sustained us as a people for all these thousands of years, although it doesn't hurt. But it's our creativity in a larger sense. Humor is part of it, no doubt. And Agnon was a great humorist in many of his works. But that's the response. You know, trauma hasn't gone away. I mean, we're right now. I'm right now in my safe room, which thankfully the last 3 or 4 days we haven't had to use. People elsewhere here in Israel up north, they're still going in and out of the safe room all the time. I have a son who's serving in the army. The last 5 weeks have been surreal, bizarre. The last 3 years have been surreal, bizarre. This is part of the life of the Jewish people. And as we all pray for peace and have hope in whatever we think the best outcome of these difficult times are and will be, and people of good conscience can debate how they see that playing out. That's not our topic, thankfully. But it is fascinating to watch how the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all of you abroad, the Jewish people who care about Jewish life and Jewish literature and Jewish learning, how we, each of us, engage as individuals and as a community in creative acts. And there are all types of creative acts. They're not all black words on white paper. It's a really fascinating thing to witness. It doesn't always happen in real time. There's often a lag. There's often a sifting between good culture and that which will be left behind. That's a kind of natural sloughing off of the dross. But it is fascinating to watch, and indeed, it is somewhat comforting to know that we will continue to be creative, even as we struggle with the traumas of Jewish history. I think it's an appropriate note to strike now, just a day and a half before we'll mark once again Yom HaShoah. So thank you all very much, and Lee, thanks so much for having me. You owe me an invitation to actual warm Santa Barbara. Hope to visit with you in person soon. I think there probably maybe some questions that have come in, and I'm happy to stay on as long as you like. And you can get my contact information from Lee and from the good folks at the Taubman Symposium if you have thoughts that you'd like to share with me privately afterwards, or I can put it up in the chat as well.
Well, Rabbi Saks, you're thanking us. That's the wrong way around. We're thanking you for this wonderful and dramatic storytelling about a storyteller. Most interesting, highly insightful. We're very fortunate to have been able to include you in the program this year at such a late date when you are so busy, I'm sure, and are privileged to benefit from the expertise. I want to let everyone know that there will be a video available in a week, 10 days or so, but let's move to questions. I don't actually see them in my screen. Were there any?
I see there are a couple of questions that I see here, Lee.
Okay.
One is by Dr. O. Davis, who
Well, you read the question to us, and
the question is: did Agnon write in Hebrew as a bow to the holy language, or as a Zionistic point? So I think I mentioned earlier that it was a curious choice to commit himself to being a Hebrew author from a very early age. He arrives in the land of Israel at the age of 20, and never publishes another word in Yiddish at that point. And as I said, of course, there were a handful of the audience for Hebrew literature was minuscule compared to Yiddish literature. From an economic standpoint, it made no sense. Of course, today, how many readers of Yiddish literature are there in the source, and how many readers of Hebrew are there? But for Agnon, it wasn't just about the holy language per se. There was a certain aspect of Zionism, but I think it was a commitment to the kind of writing he wanted to do, which was that intertextual engagement, that kind of pseudo, I'm making air quotes here, pseudo or pseudo midrashic writing, in which his writing is in dialogue with the holy sources, the Bible and the rabbinic literature principally. And to do that, Hebrew was a much better vehicle to be engaged in that kind of intertextual work. Had he, for whatever reason, in a parallel universe, remained a Yiddish author, he would have been handicapped in achieving that, or he would have developed in a very, very different way as an author. Gordon Schatz points to Psalm 137 doesn't appear explicitly in Agnon's speech. You're correct, and I did mention that. I mentioned that I find an echo of it between the lines. And then Gordon writes, if this psalm could be intertextually read into his acceptance speech, it's the end of the psalm, also an expression of response to catastrophe, even of violent wishful thinking. Many thanks for your. So I elided the end of the psalm. In Psalm 137, the exiles sitting in Babylon, thinking of if they should forget Jerusalem, then sing a song of retribution against the Babylonian captors, later perhaps the Romans. At least that's the midrashic reading of it, of what will happen, and that's not implicit in Agnon, I don't think. I will draw your attention to an excellent book by Professor Ruth Weiss called Jews and Power, where she has a very interesting and compelling reading of Psalm 137, where she does engage with the point you make, Gordon.
Further questions that are appearing to you, but apparently not to me.
Okay, those are the only two questions I've seen, but I don't see anything in the chat, so perhaps
maybe that was it.
Perhaps
no other raised hands.
Mm-hmm.
No other raised hands. No.
Nope. But it's nice to see
Going
so
once,
many familiar
going
names.
Twice. Okay. Before ending, I want to be sure to mention the final two Taubman Symposia for this season. Both of them are in May. The first one is on May 3rd, a talk by historian Pamela Nadell on her new, very thought-provoking and timely book, Anti-Semitism, An American Tradition. That's on May 3rd. Then the second one is on May 17th, a talk by Aviva Sornberg titled Moses Veiled and Unveiled, referring there to the veil over Moses' face after he descended Mount Sinai the second time, as found in Exodus chapter 34. Well, I look forward to greeting everyone then, and thank Rabbi Saks again for a wonderful presentation, and look forward to seeing everyone again in May. Thank you.
I thank you.